Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Kansas and Wichita public affairs and government. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sunday morning at 8:30 a.m. and then at 4:30 p.m. in the afternoon. Also on The Voice for Liberty, that's my site on the internet at wichitaliberty.org. You'll find all the episodes of Wichita Liberty TV there, along with show notes for each episode, and then all the other information that I and others provide there on Wichita Liberty TV, wichitaliberty.org. This week, our guest, Danedri Herbert. She's the editor of the Sentinel, a new online publication covering Kansas and western Missouri. She's an experienced journalist, having worked as an editor and reporter for most recently for the Gardner News and a columnist for the Kansas City Star. Her work has appeared besides in the Star, the Hutchinson News, Budget and Tax News, and K-Stater magazine. And besides her professional journalism, she blogs under the name Gidget Southway at the blog Inside Kansas GOP. And last summer she was on this show right after she was outed as Danedri Herbert. Here's something interesting. She once won a competition for being the most average person and is listed in a book, The Average American, The Extraordinary Search for the Nation's Most Ordinary Citizen. Although I think having won that competition, that elevates you above average there.
Right.
So
Slightly.
anyway, Danedri graduated from Kansas State University with a degree in journalism. She and her husband live in Johnson County with their dog, Keller. So, Danedri, the Sentinel, started up in January this year. How's that doing?
It's going well. We've got our first reader from Iceland. So, you know, the internet gives you like, Iceland, it was exciting. Somebody from Iceland cares what's happening in little Kansas, I guess. So it's going well. The numbers are going well, and I hope we're having some effect slowly and maybe changing the discussion or turning the discussion a little bit.
So what is the mission of the Sentinel? Why did it get started?
Well, it's to hold government and media accountable. I think you guys know down in Wichita with the Eagle, sometimes they leave some important issues or facts on the cutting room floor. So the goal, from my perspective, is just to give them a little hand slapping when they need it, and also to put the other facts out there so everybody has the information if they need it. And of course your site does that. There's lots of places people can go to find some of the information. It's just one more voice, because as a conservative we're kind of battling what I call the wall of sound, just the liberal wall of sound. As many voices and avenues to break through that wall is a goal.
Yeah. So you often publish, I would say, the Sentinel, stories that tell a different story than the mainstream media. And by mainstream media, I'm talking about our state's established newspapers, TV stations, and radio stations. So how can we tell who has the correct story with the correct facts?
I would say, obviously we do. The Sentinel does. But if you're a little more, you need more than that, than just me saying so. I'm not going to say, like, what I try to do is not necessarily cover the exact same thing that the mainstream media covers, but to go and get a little bit different of an angle. So if you're reading both, you should be getting a pretty complete story. I'm not going to say the mainstream media is making up facts necessarily, but in my opinion, they're leaving some important things on the cutting room floor. For example, the Medicaid expansion stuff going on right now. There's a hospital that might be closing in Topeka, and it's closing because of Medicaid expansion. And of course the lobbyists are saying that because they want to expand Medicaid. But if you start looking at the numbers, these are challenges that have been occurring for a long time. And by the way, there's a hospital right next door,
Stormont
Vale, who is making money. I mean, there's so much more to the story, and until I would like to give ourselves credit, but we brought it up, and now it's starting to get some traction that maybe Medicaid expansion isn't the only reason this hospital can't survive.
Well, Karl, you've had experience as a reporter for a time, and you've certainly
But that
had
was
your
back in the 20th century, so
You've certainly had your battles with the Wichita Eagle during your
That's true.
time as as serving on the Sedgwick County Commission.
And as the executive director for the Kansas Taxpayers Network.
Yeah.
The big problem, indeed, Danedri, and I hope I pronounced that correctly,
You did.
outlined it. It's more by omission and what doesn't get covered, or the fact is that you get part of the story and it's only one side, and this is supposedly a news article as opposed to an editorial where you're just expecting commentary.
Where
about
people are paid to have viewpoints, just like we do here.
Exactly. But when you get in an environment where, for instance, if a state official says, we're still only paying, the state's only paying $4,000 per pupil per year for K-12, and that's all the story gets, that's sort of like saying, we're going to count how much money Bill Gates has, but we're not going to count his Microsoft stock.
Yeah, I want to do some follow-up on that when we come back from a commercial break. So Bob Weeks again for Wichita Liberty TV. We'll be back in a moment. Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, of course, Karl Peterjohn, my co-host, and our special guest, Danedri Herbert of the Sentinel. So here's an example that really I was astonished to read this week. The Hutchinson News published an article covering a speech, I think it was to the Rotary Club there, made by Dale Dennis. Now, he's I think it's Deputy Commissioner at the Kansas State Department of Education, and I think he has charge of school finance. So he's definitely...
Bob, let me jump in, and
yeah.
if I may interrupt, he's been the acting, not deputy, but he's also been the acting superintendent, which is, normally that's an appointed position, but he's been on this position for ages and has literally been there for decades, going back to, I think, when the school finance lawsuit started in the 1980s.
Well, he gave a speech there that said, in 1992, base state aid per pupil was $3,600. And he said, now base state aid is $3,852. So some 25 years later, it's only gone up a couple $100 per student. Now, and he said the numbers are shocking, he told the Hutchinson Rotary Club. That's what the Hutchinson News reported. Right. Now, if that was all you knew, that 25 years ago we were at $3,600 and now we're only at $3,800, you might be alarmed. But that's not all the Kansas state government spends on schools. Depending on how you count it, it's either $7,000 or $8,500 per student this year. And there's other spending, local and federal spending as well. So as far as I know, Dale Dennis was correct on these numbers, but he didn't tell the whole story. So what's the responsibility of the reporter at this time to bring some context or background to these questions, because that's what we need journalists to do, I think.
I'll tell you, this is what frustrates me as a former just straight-laced reporter. Sometimes when you go to things like that, it's very easy. You have a deadline to just, this is what this guy said, and put it out there. And I don't want to bash the reporter. I'm not even sure who wrote it. I don't want to bash the reporter for doing that, because I think every reporter who has to meet a deadline has definitely fallen into that trap. The frustrating part for me as a conservative is that while the reporter allowed that to just stand with no, but they also spend money on this, and this, and it kind of depends on, the little qualifiers. If Governor Brownback says he's going to add 10,000 jobs over the span of his career as governor, every time he falls 3 jobs short. I mean, they put the qualifier in there. There's no, I said I almost 10,000 jobs. They want the 10,000 and not a second more will suffice. And that's the very subtle bias that I think is very prevalent throughout all of Kansas, which is kind of strange as red of a state that we are.
But it's not subtle. I mean, when we moved to a school funding formula of block grants, where you basically gave all the money and gave the school districts, removed from the school districts, they'd complained about how they lacked local control to allocate where funds met. Well, when you block grant it, they can spend the money wherever they saw fit.
Yeah, great
and
flexibility.
They're saying, well, this is even more unconstitutional than the old system that we want to go back to, which, by the way, we litigated as being unconstitutional too. Also, now none of this seems to get reported in most of the, in what passes for the mainstream press in this state, Danedri. And is the Sentinel going to be in a position to be able to go into this? As you're kind of a small a small player, and just for full disclosure, I've shared information with the Sentinel since it kind of started too. So,
and we appreciate that. I hope so. We may not be able to hit every issue all the time, but my personal goal, I can't speak for Jack, I have another coworker, and we also have a board who directs some of what they do. They're not very hands-on, but I would like to find issues as they're happening and get the other side of the story when we can. And definitely school funding is going to be, it has been a big one. It's going to continue to be a big one. And I think my goal is yes. I don't know that we'll get all of it because it's so overwhelming. I like to break it up in 800 words or less. I mean, you could write a 200-page book on just the history of Kansas school finance since 1980. No one would read all the way to the end of that.
Well, it sounds like some of the decisions coming out of the Kansas Supreme Court and their edicts in terms of lengthy volume. But let me ask you, Bob raised the question. We had a high state official talk about how we're spending about $4,000 by the state each year on K-12 per pupil. Is that an accurate number? And if not, what is an accurate number, and why is that 4,000 and not accurate?
It depends on what you count. When they use the 4,000 number, they don't use things like they don't what they spend on the building itself. That doesn't count, it's very strange.
Well, it also doesn't include things like weightings for
Right.
the at-risk students and the English as second language students, which are these types of students. They say, oh, these are so expensive to educate, yet the state gives them a lot of extra money. The at-risk weighting is 45% of base state aid. So for each student that they're able to say is in the at-risk category, they get almost 50% more money. So they're getting a lot of money. It's just that in this case, I think Dale Dennis, I'm sure, was accurate to the penny on his numbers. It just wasn't the whole story.
Right.
Yeah. Well, hold on to that idea. When we may amplify on that when we come back. This is Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, co-host Karl Peterjohn, our guest Danedri Herbert of the Sentinel. So Danedri, as Gidget Southway on your personal blog, you had a headline just this week titled "Farewell Party for Governor Brownback in the Works." I was kind of surprised to read that.
Which part?
Well, that there was actually planning for a going away party.
Well, I maybe was playing a little loose with the title. They're calling it a reunion party.
Oh, okay.
But they're having a reunion. They've invited back Brownback staffers from his congressional days, people who worked in his office when he was in the Senate, and people who work for him now, and they're having a reunion party. I just think it's strangely timed. It's in the next couple of weeks. No one has told me the specific date. I think they're afraid I'll try to crash it. But it is happening. Or so I hear.
Well, there is this speculation that the governor will be offered some ambassadorship to who knows where pretty soon. But so that kind of brings up the whole topic of, next year we are going to select a new governor. Governor Brownback is limited by term limits from running. We do have some declared candidates. On the Democratic side, we have Wichita Mayor Karl Brewer has announced and has been running for a while. Who else do you expect to see throw their hat in the ring to become our next governor?
Well, Wink Hartman, who's also from Wichita,
That's right. Forgot about him.
in the mix.
So he's a Republican side.
He's a Republican side. The Democrat. I've heard Greg Orman, who ran against Pat Roberts for the Senate as an independent. That tech guy from Google, I think Google Maps. There's a guy who moved back to Lawrence.
Okay.
The Democratic.
I don't remember his name either.
Me neither. What's his face? But he's probably got a lot of money.
Is he a Democrat?
He's a Democrat,
Yeah, okay.
and the Kansas Democrats say he has not. He came back to Kansas to work on politics, but he's not going to run for anything. So I'm just speculating. And then on the Republican side, Kobach, I think, was thinking
That's
about
our
it.
Secretary of State, Chris
I
Kobach.
thought he was going to announce in March, and he hasn't yet. So I might be wrong. And then I've heard Kevin Yoder, Congressman Kevin Yoder, who's the 3rd District in Johnson County, Kansas City area. And then there's Ed O'Malley, some dude that I've got nothing.
Ed's a former state representative from Johnson County who's been involved with the Kansas leadership, one of the adjuncts of the Kansas Health Foundation.
Yeah, so
Kansas Leadership Center. So Ed's here in town.
Is he here?
He's been here, and he's moved to Wichita with the Kansas Leadership Center.
having, I think he's on kind of a long-term tour around the state, meeting with groups, having
An
online town halls
exploratory-
on Facebook.
It's
some
like almost
things like
a campaign,
that.
but not quite, I guess.
Yeah. So if Kevin Yoder is interested in being Kansas governor, then that opens up the Kansas 3rd Congressional District, which is pretty much Johnson County and Wyandotte County, I believe.
I actually don't think Yoder will. The kind of the big fly in the ointment in I think all of Kansas right now is Pat Roberts says he's going to run for Senate again in 2020, and there are a whole lot of people, like I suspect Congressman Yoder, who are kind of interested in that, but nobody's going to challenge the chair of the Senate Agricultural Committee in Kansas. I mean, it's politically not very, it's just, so.
Well, Kevin Yoder might be concerned a little bit because I think Johnson County, did it vote for Trump last year, or was it very narrow victory?
It was narrow for Hillary,
Okay.
but there's a Democrat who's already, the guy who ran against Yoder has already declared, I think Yoder's okay if he stays, and that I think he's fine, actually.
And over in the 2nd Congressional District, which is Topeka, and then on down through southeast Kansas, Lynn Jenkins, the current representative, has already announced that she's going to retire. Thought at one time she would run for governor, but now she says no. I hear she's getting married, so good luck to her on that. So we have Paul Davis, who ran for governor against Sam Brownback a few years ago. He's already had events. Who else up there?
Do you know Steve Fitzgerald? Senator Steve Fitzgerald has already declared.
He's from Leavenworth.
He's from
and
Leavenworth.
I think very much on the conservative bloc in the Kansas Senate, I'd say.
The only other name I've heard, I had heard Senator LaTurner, who is now the state treasurer, and he said he's running for treasurer. And then the other name I'd heard was Karen Tyson. She's the
chair of the Senate Tax Committee.
Yes,
and she's from, I believe, south of
Lynn
south
County.
South of Ottawa,
south
somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Derek Schmidt, the Attorney General, I had heard was rumored, but then I heard he wasn't. But now I hear he might be back in because the field is kind of clearing some. There's Tyson and Fitzgerald are both pretty conservative, so.
I'd heard Attorney General Schmidt was thinking about running for governor, too. So
I heard that too.
He was down here at the Ron Estes election night party.
Which leads you to believe he's running for something.
Well, Chris Kobach was here too.
So was Yoder.
Oh, I didn't notice that. So.
I might be talking out of school. I was not there, but I heard Congressman Yoder was there too.
Well, it's a well-attended event.
Right.
And anyway, so let's take another moment off for a commercial break. Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Well, welcome back to this last session or segment of Wichita Liberty TV for today. I'm Bob Weeks, co-host Karl Peterjohn, our special guest Danedri Herbert of the Sentinel today. So, Danedri, you've been a reporter and editor. You've covered local and state government for a number of years. So, what do you think is the one thing, or maybe two or three things, that the average person doesn't really know or understand about the way government works that they should know?
Well, I will say at the local level, I haven't necessarily seen this quite as much at the state level, but at the local level, it's kind of shocking to me how school boards and city councils and county commissions even just give such deference to their county manager or the bureaucrats.
The bureaucrats
School
superintendent.
the bureaucrats say this is what we need to do, and they all go, okay. And it's kind of stunning to me because even conservatives, people who say they're conservative, will say, well, the superintendent said we needed to spend $47,000 on a grand piano, so who am I to question the expert?
And I think especially in smaller towns, the school superintendent is one of the pillars of the community usually.
Definitely.
And I know here in Wichita, where we have the strong city manager form of government, that you know, he has a master's degree in this and that, or maybe even a doctor's degree in some cases, and he's viewed as an unimpeachable authority sometimes.
Well, and I don't think that, essentially they're lobbyists, and I don't want to knock all bureaucrats, because we need them. There's a place for them, but they're their own form of lobbying, and they're lobbying for what I call kingdom building. Mm-hmm. If you're the parks guy, and you see that the public works guy has 10 employees and you only have 9, I feel like there's a little bit of, and you see it in big business too. The difference is, if big business A wants to do it, I don't have to pay for the cost increase just because there are 2 different departments are arguing who's the most important. Yeah. So
well, public choice tells us that, yeah, for bureaucrats, that's the way they profit, by a bigger budget, more employees, more power, since they can't profit, at least legally, in the normal way that businesses do. So
they have an agenda, and it's not necessarily a bad one. It's just when people look at big business, they say, oh, they just want to profit. Well, they have things to gain as well.
Yeah. Danedri, returning back to Kansas politics again, you know, down here in Sedgwick County and surrounding 4th District of Kansas, we had a special election last week. I think from watching you on Facebook, you were quite apprehensive and nervous. Matter of fact, I think you said today on radio that you were doing scared eating, and I thought, oh, that's my problem too. Tell us about what you think we should learn from this election down here.
Well, I was freaking out at first. I looked at that 24, the 24-point turn, and it's just. And then I started looking a little more carefully at the numbers, and I even talked to some people who weren't maybe very politically active, and like, oh, I didn't vote. I knew he was going to win, or I forgot to go. Well, in a presidential election, or even a midterm, at a normal November time, the 105,000 Republicans who stayed home this election, they're going to go back to the polls, and most of them are center-right at least, and they're not going to vote for the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democrat. I mean, they're not. So and a 7% win anywhere else. If Yoder won by 7% in Johnson County, we would be like, yeah, it was a landslide. So I had a moment of freaking out, but now reality has set in.
Partly because of how we vote, and I think something similar appeared in Georgia just this week. But let me ask you the question. The point has been made, and the media keeps repeating it, that Kansas media anyway, that Governor Brownback is this big burden on the Republican Party and the Republican candidates, and then he was narrowly reelected in 2014. But in 2016, all 5 Republicans were reelected to the Congress, most of them overwhelmingly. Senator Moran had another landslide win. Ron Estes, our state treasurer, became the newest member of the congressional delegation. Is the media they keep having these themes or memes, whatever they
narratives.
want. Narratives, I think would probably be the fair word. Is part of the Kansas Sentinel's role to kind of provide a reality check for some of these narratives?
A balance for those narratives. They're reading it this way, and there's another way to look at it, and it's probably, sincerely, somewhere, the reality's somewhere in the middle. But if you're only getting this side, reality is skewed, you know? You're getting skewed. I do think Kansas, though, has taken a small turn left, I will say. I agree with you.
Well, especially the elections last year and the legislative action where we've had passage of a large tax increase and Medicaid expansion. The governor vetoed, and the vetoes were barely sustained, very close. Right. So definitely, there's a bit of stuff going on there. So we appreciate the Sentinel. And as a nonpartisan, because a lot of the times when, like on, let's say, the Estes thing, they'll get feedback from Republican partisans, like the state chair, the executive director or whatever, and they're naturally saying, oh, well, you know, they're making excuses as to why it was only 7 points. But I think we need to be honest and to say that 7 points was pretty dang close, and Republicans better start planning pretty hard for the next election. So, well, Danedri, Karl, we're just out of time for today. So Danedri Herbert of the Sentinel, thanks very much for stopping by today. And we'll be back next week with more Wichita Liberty TV.
Thank you.